Cool. Okay.
Does the video have any context? Do you want to give any context to what we're about to watch and experience?
Well, I think a big movement that is going on at the moment, which I talked about just before, is the Great Resignation. This is, from my understanding, it's happening in America predominantly. I've seen some articles to suggest in Australia it's not as prevalent, but nevertheless, it's, I think, a global awareness of the idea that work is not life, essentially. And I think with that idea in mind, or that movement in mind, there's this video and this idea by author Alain de Botton, who I really enjoy. He receives a lot of criticism from philosophers. A lot of philosophers do not like him, and they do not like him because they think that he dumbs down philosophy. And I think to some extent, if you were to read his books, it is not in any sense the same type of philosophy you would read in like if you were to read Peter Singer's Practical Ethics, like it's very different. But with that in mind, I think Alain de Botton is really good at synthesizing ideas and communicating very, very well. And I would say he does that better than some philosophers even. And he's able to connect with people much better than I would say some philosophers are. And I think that's commendable. And he talks about this idea of status anxiety. It's a really good book. I recommend the book. But yeah, I guess that's the
And
context.
I think this is contextual to especially the modern professional world of capitalism and the work-life balance movement, right? Whatever this idea is, which we also spoke to Paul about. We spoke about work-life balance in the Future of Work podcast. And essentially, to give a quick reminder, I remember he was saying this idea of work-life balance is bullshit, right? Work is prioritized, and then around work is created life. But he's saying the idea is to flip the equation around and create life first, and then create work around life. Life is primary instead of work. And so what I'm hearing is, in a similar way, Alain de Botton's video on status anxiety contextualizes in the space of work-life balance and trying to get somewhere and be someone and achieve certain things, and whatever that may give us, something along those lines is what you're trying to present.
That's right. And we can dive into that video right now.
Status anxiety is one of the most pernicious, widespread of all diseases. It can ruin large sections of our lives, and a good approach to life means having a philosophy that we can deal with it and recognize the problem for what it is. Look, as soon as you finish college, what starts to matter is what you do in life. The first question becomes, what do you do? And according to how you answer that question, people are either incredibly pleased to see you or make a run for it. In other words, how clever and nice and friendly and sympathetic you are ceases to matter in most social occasions. We live in a world surrounded by snobs. What is a snob? A snob is someone who takes a small part of you and uses that to judge the whole of you.
I love that definition. I just wanted to give a quick anecdote. So I went out to a bar the other night. Obviously in Australia, we're very lucky dealing with COVID and everything. And so we're able to, go out and socialize. And I went out for the first time in a while, but it was like a small gathering. It was a party, maybe like 20, 30 people in amongst a group of other people. And I was having conversations with a number of people, and it was a fantastic moment where I was able to connect with people. But a common thread amongst all of it was that when you ask people, or when you engage in the initial conversation, like what Alain says, the first question, or one of the first questions, or you can hear it coming, is that, oh, what do you do? What do you get up to? And I think there's two responses. The first is that people will judge you accordingly to what you do. But I think the second response is, and maybe this is where the differences between Australian culture and other cultures come into play, whereas some people won't really care and they'll want to talk about other things. And I get the sense that now that I'm more aware of the anti-work movement, and we've had conversations with people like Paul, that people really do not enjoy work. And I think it's quite interesting to hear people talk about work, because whenever it's talked about, it seems like there's this underlying thread of, really, I don't want to do this and I would rather shoot myself, but I have to do this. And I think that's really, I mean, it's in one part it's sad, but on another part it's quite interesting to see how we've gotten to the place where we are because of work. And now it's, I think, at a point where we can choose how much we'd like to do. And I think people are choosing now to say, well, I don't really want to work this much. Do you have any thoughts on that, Shasha?
So I hear two things that you're talking about. On one level, you're talking about the way we interact when we first meet someone, right? What's the first question we ask, right? What do you do? A lot of times, and I don't know if it's just Australian culture. I've heard this in a lot of other cultures as well. When maybe I've been to like a couple of networking events, and the very first thing is, so what do you do? What are you working on? Right? Working is the primary thing. And I have felt that those interactions have been less meaningful and less authentic in some way because they're solely driven by the efficient cooperation that could happen, right? Like, okay, we're in this room. We're just going to see what everyone does. If this person leads me to some benefit in the future, if this person can act as a means to an end, I will pursue this. And if it doesn't, next, move on. Yeah, it was great meeting you. Let's have lunch together sometime, and then boom, switch, whatever, right? Very self-oriented way of thinking about meeting people. But I think if we can change the question of what we ask or how we interact with people initially, and not ask what we do, but ask maybe who you are, who are you? Even though that might be a little weird question, but I think the way you put it, the way you say it in a more playful way, I think that gets a lot of interesting responses. Or what is your story, right? Once I know a person a little bit, then that's a question I really like to ask. So dude, I've known you for so long, but who the fuck are you, man? Like, what's your story? What's up with who you really are in this moment?
Something interesting though, which is a challenge to what you just said, and I think is a part of the anti-work movement, is that our idea of ourselves is so intrinsically tied to our work. So even if I was to ask you, Shasha, who the fuck are you? Somehow or some way or another, work will be tied in somehow. And I think it's quite interesting because it's almost like this identities of worker and self become tied together, and it's very hard to detach them from each other. It's almost like impossible.
It's an identity that's been given by society. This is who I am.
Yeah,
this is what I do, and this repetition of doing this thing brings some order in the chaos of reality.
Yeah. And so I've also, actually, maybe I won't talk about this now, maybe later in the video, but there's this author called Bertrand Russell, really famous philosopher. He wrote a book called In Praise of Idleness. And he says that, he says something along the lines of, is that we need leisure, not only because it helps us get away from work, but we need leisure because that's when we can actually engage in the things we want to engage in. And he also says that the point of leisure is not so you can recharge to work more. The point of leisure is to learn and engage with life fully. And I think this is something Paul talked about, that the purpose of work should not be to recharge. It should be to live.
Right.
But yeah.
Another way of putting this, another linguistic difference you could say, is working or doing is to the same as becoming. We are constantly onto something which is helping us grow and become rather than just be. But then leisure, on the other hand, is just a state of being, a state of peace, a state of rest, where it's not to recharge to work again, but I would still argue there is some degree of healing and recharging that happens in a state of being. There's something magical that happens that I don't think we understand. For example, this is side tangent, no need to go there, but random seed in your head. I don't think anyone knows why we sleep, for example. We're not working when we're sleeping, right? But we all sleep. And why the fuck is that? Some theories here and there, but I don't think we have found something very concrete to explain why everyone sleeps. But anyway, side tangent. My point is, what was my point? I sort of went into the tangent. Pull me back real quick.
So you were talking about leisure and using that as time of
being versus becoming. Right, what you're saying is there is becoming. So I'm saying what do you do is a great question for if you're trying to become something. Or I think we are all trying to become something, but in the state of when we were becoming, yes, what do you do also should be there. The doing and collaboration or practical things, I think, makes sense. But at the same time, there is the being, which sort of opens up your identity so that you're not just this worker, not just like a, whatever you're born into, the social conditioning. You have the freedom or a moment of pause to become something else, to get this pause or liminal space where some transformation happens paradoxically to lead to more becoming thereafter. I don't know if that sort of metaphor makes sense, but being versus becoming.
Yeah, awesome, bro. Let's keep watching.
And our dominant snobbery nowadays is job snobbery. So what is on your business card determines your identity. This is a deeply frightening vision. Partly it's frightening because most of us are unable to bring our true richness of character and personality in line with our business card. We are being judged, we feel, in a humiliating way. We feel there's so much in us that has not got an expression in capitalism. Capitalism is a machine that recognizes outward financial external achievement. And most of us carry all kinds of richness which we're unable to translate into that language. There are very few of us whose full complexity of character has been brought out, as it were, on their business card. Most of us, what is special about us requires love. And by love, I mean imagination. It requires someone to say, even though that person looks a bit, it could be anything, boring, uninteresting, unimportant, dull. Actually, that's because I'm only looking at them in the first 30 seconds. They need more time.
Yeah, so I mean, he was talking about this idea of snobbery where you use one element of a person, for example, where they work, and you use that in a way to judge their whole character, which I think is like a fantastic definition for what a snob is. But anyways, he was saying that because of the system we live in this capitalistic system that values certain things such as output, such as your job title, that gives the outcome of that is that we evaluate people's whole identity based on their job. And so, and he says the antidote for that is love, and love in a very broad sense. Love in the sense of, I think, I interpret love as compassion, where he says you see the person not only for their job title, but for who they are, because their job title is not enough to see their whole self. It's only part of themselves.
And he also says love as imagination. So I think in order to have love, we need to have imagination as well. And what in this context it would be is that I am able to imagine that there will be more depth to this person that I see on the surface level. This one piece of the story that I see, there may be more. And the possibility of imagining that, I think, invites love and curiosity and the want and need to connect, right? And inquire compassionately, as you said, to see who this other person really is, what their story is, what makes them broken, what makes them feel alive, what makes them cry, right? All these things come only once there is this sort of breaking of the ice, ironically, with love and imagination. So I find that very fascinating.
Yeah, I would say that my criticism of that is that I feel like that is an individualistic solution to a systemic problem. So I think so what I mean by that is he's saying the solution is all individuals in the world must be compassionate and loving towards everyone else. And I think that is true. And I think that
that's one part of it. Yeah.
That's one part of it. But I think this is the systems thinking versus individual thinking that I think comes into play, which is at the end of the day, it's the system which is perpetuating this sort of thinking. And in order to have any wide scale change, it is the system itself that needs reforming. And I know this, I feel like we're going on a capitalistic, anti-capitalistic binge.
So here's where I would challenge it, because I don't actually think it's anti-capitalistic. I actually disagree with this notion that, yes, I see why capitalism sort of infuriates this problem, right? Resumes as a classic example. This image of a resume kept coming, where we judge the entire depth and life of a person by one page written in Times New Roman .12 in a certain format, in a certain
Yeah.
structure, to give it like fill it in, right? And
Yeah.
all it's already predetermined, so that I can have this on my resume. I will go through these experiences, right, just to fill that resume and build that life. But very disenchanting. So capitalism definitely puts that. But as you said, to scale a solution of the job market, right, of hiring someone, bringing someone into a team or a tribe anthropologically, I think there needs to be a solution. Obviously resumes is the one that sort of scales, because you have AI systems that you can efficiently read and tell this person's stories and see if there's a match. But I think there's more to be done, and innovation, I think, can allow new ways of expression through art and creativity and collection of information and data and storytelling to give the true essence of a person's life, rather than this sort of one pager, disenchanting, mostly false narrative that's created about a person. So I don't actually think capitalism, yes, capitalism is the problem, but also I think the solution. Similar to people are the problem and the solution.
Yes, although I would say though that it sounds like in order for that to change on a wide scale, the system would still need to be adjusted or changed. Would you agree? Or would you disagree?
I think it's already happening. That's the thing. So I think with the movement of like the great resignation, people are looking towards moving for a more free life, for a life where life comes before work. And now with the movement of blockchain and NFTs and DAOs, I think people are finding more and more opportunities to be able to say fuck you to work and have their own individual practice or their own artistry being able to make them a lot of money, so that they don't need to continue to live the corporate slave life. They can find something they can do that is meaningful to them and still be remunerated for that value, right? They don't no more need to be a poor dying artist on the street stinking begging for money. So I think it's changing. The system is already changing, and that's what makes me hopeful.
Yes, I don't know. I think Zizek is sort of watching Zizek videos is almost like a poison chalice, because once I've sort of take on that perspective, it's hard for me to sort of break that line of thinking. And what I mean by that is that I agree, like these movements are created and they're gaining traction, but how much traction is needed for a system to change? So I'm not a historian, so I don't know in terms of all systemic change that has been made, but like very quick example, the climate change movement. Climate change movement has been going on since I think the 60s even, gained traction a little bit in the 90s, but it's only of recent with movements like people like Greta Thunberg, David Attenborough that have like really pushed the movement. And globally, there's like global climate marches, right? People that are, saying enough is enough, and people recognize it's a problem. And scientists say that with 99% certainty that anthropomorphic changes are being made, right? But even then, the system's not changing, right? So yes, the system is gaining traction, but it's not. Is it changing? And yes, you could say small changes, but that's not systemic change. That's change made on the governmental or individual level.
Don't know. I would question the notion of there being, a revolution almost, where it's like in a few days, a lot happens. But I would actually argue that is already happening. With the creation of technology, we are changing exponentially. Like we think linearly, but in reality, technology scales exponentially, right? So 30 linear steps leads to 30, but 30 exponential steps leads to 1 billion. Right? Technology scales at this rate of exponential change. So I think it's happening. We just don't see it. And sooner than later, it will be here. I think it's already here. And it's almost like, in terms of a movement, the book that comes to mind for me is Tipping Point by Malcolm Gladwell. I've not read it, but I think that's the notion he's talking about, that this change, it's not just one day thing, but it like keeps building up. And then there is that tipping point, and and in a way, I'm guessing a tipping point can always be happening. Right? Every moment is a tipping point to something else, like a domino effect.
No, I see where you're coming from. I think you're returning back to the original point that Elena was making, though. I think love, in that sense of being compassionate to other people, I think I would agree with. My only critique would be is that I think that it is an individual solution. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just more so.
But that's where decentralization makes individuals into collectives, right? Bottom up. It doesn't have to be imposed from the top down to make it systemic. I think there can be like individual agents making change and coming together to form communities that are
Yeah.
decentralized in nature, yet centralized through the system to be able to create systemic change from this bottom up movement. I'm just a little nerd and biased around this, and I know my bias, but I will stand by it.
Yeah, no, I love it. Let's keep watching
Finish the video.
The cruelty of the modern world, the cruelty of New York City, for example, is that this is a city where people give you 30 seconds and not much longer if you're not careful. And that's very challenging. It cuts people up inside. It literally drives you crazy.
I would question what he just said. I see where he's coming from, and this is what my belief used to be, that like this 30-second judge the book by its cover, constantly at work, constantly hustling, constantly being on time, right? Moving along, hustling in New York way, poses a challenge. And it's not the best and the most healthiest thing for human beings. I'm all about encountering another being, having those I-thou relationships. But at the same time, I think this 30-second challenge poses I think a challenge that turns into an opportunity to be more creative and to be more almost out there, right? So like where I speak from, right, this thought comes from my class that I'm taking called the Ultimate Entrepreneurial Challenge. Well, ultimately the class is rated one of the best entrepreneurship classes in the country. And what this professor is doing is giving us a bunch of challenges, and every challenge we have 30 seconds to present the answer, whole business case in 30 seconds. So no more can we give them like PowerPoint slides with bullets and, information being read out and explained. No, we have to do something so quickly that it grabs our attention, tells the entire story, and leaves the audience entertained and put in a state of wonder, right? A point is made, and it's also very entertaining and hooking. So I think putting the challenge of 30 seconds and sort of pushing ourselves in these environments to an extent helps us grow. It helps us become more creative beings. It helps us express ourselves and accelerate our expression. And I'm not saying this is necessarily good or bad. I just think it's a thing that may be interesting to do, as Zizek would say.
Yeah. I hate to say it, but I sort of stand on the fence because I agree with you. And then at the same time, I also agree with Elaine in the sense that I think that to judge a person's character, or not their character, but to judge a person in the context of, let's say, like job interviews based on 30-second interviews or 30-second presentation, pitch, blah, 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 I think is quite harsh. But I guess that's how competition works. That's pure economic competition. And
I think Alain here is taking a more idealistic take, that this is how you should be. You shouldn't judge people by the book, right? Idealism. You should ideally do this. But a more realist would say, no, in reality, with our attention spans shrinking and shrinking and shrinking, what 30 seconds, bro? 8 seconds, you have to be able to make that first quick impression. So a realist would say, okay, I'm actually going to make this more fun and creative and take it up as a challenge to do that really quickly rather than take all the time in the world to do it. Again, I'm not for acceleration all the time. I actually like the time to get to know someone and slow things down, right? But at the same time, while I am an idealist, as you know, I also like to take on the role of not pessimist, but a realist, and accept things as they are and make something happen based on that okay, I know this is what it is. How can I flow and surf the wave rather than go against it and say this is how things should be? Or how can I shape the wave while I'm surfing on it, is how I've sort of conceptualize this tension.
Yeah, man. I think overall the video is quite interesting because it does tie quite nicely into the whole anti-work movement, and also on deeper questions of what does it mean to be you? What does it mean to be Xavier? What does it mean to be Shashwat? What does it mean to be me? And I think the now what, or the so what of this whole thing is that, of this whole video and this movement in general, is that people are starting to question themselves. And I think ideally that's what philosophy is. One part of philosophy is about, is asking yourself questions, and really difficult questions at that, and trying to arrive at new ways of seeing things, new ways of taking things on. So, I mean, like Shashwat said before, like referring to like the podcast that we had with Paul, that was quite on one, not, I don't want to use traumatic because that's so like hyperbolic, but in some senses very paradigm shifting, because that was sort of the first time where this idea or this notion that work is tied into identity was made aware to me. And I think anything that helps people challenge their identity in a good way and help them arrive at new answers is helpful. I don't know if you agree with that, Shashwat, but yeah.
Yeah, bro, I would say to be able to question and ask the question that takes a lot of guts asking, who am I think can be very jarring, very confusing, very existential, very sort of uncomfortable, but also at the same time, I think very meaningful. And very profound and life-changing in many ways. And so I agree with Alain that love and inquiry and trying to go beyond the book or the cover of the book is an ideal that I would like to follow. But at the same time, I'd like to be a realist at the same time, to be able to accept things as they are, pursue to be better, and to open up opportunities for that imagination and love and inquiry and storytelling to happen, to explore who I am and who people are, and explore the conditions of life. But at the same time, be able to be that sort of quirky little social experimenter that is able to violate expectation in the first 10 seconds and grab people's attention and be able to really spread memes, right? Sort of sows these seeds in the very first few seconds. I think that is what I would aspire for.
Yeah, man. I think that also ties into the now what as well quite nicely. But yeah, I highly recommend reading Alain's book. I think they're quite enjoyable. If you're looking for more hard philosophy, there is Joseph Piper's, what's the book called, Shashwat? The Leisure on the Basis of Work.
Right.
That's
the basis of culture, leisure, which is the basis of culture.
Yeah, that's right.
100%.
Yeah.
And I think this anti-work movement also ties into the movement of decentralization, which is something I'm really starting to get into. So I'd also recommend people to look into that if you are anti-work and you want to create a life of a life where you are playing and where work is play, and you can be creative and you can be free and take more agency for yourself as an artist, as a consultant, as an entrepreneur. The decentralization movement, the blockchain movement, I think might lead to some of these outcomes, to be able to change that narrative and create new ways of being and seeing. And that's my spiel.
Yes, bro. Awesome. As always, if you want to have a conversation with us, leave a comment in the comments below, because that's ultimately what we want to do, is have conversations with everyone and ruin our lives in the best possible ways by introducing new and interesting ideas. So yeah, that's everything from me. What about you, Shashwat?
Thank you, brother. That is everything for me as well.